number of restrictions that were put in place as to what local governments can require of school districts with regard to their planning and zoning or land use regulations. And that's caused some issues and problems as schools have gone in locations where the local government didn't have the ability to serve them adequately, or a variety of things. This particular bill now requires that a school district or a charter school, very specifically, to meet with the local government prior to the purchase, or, and this is what was added to the bill, the acquisition of a site. Apparently, I guess what was happening was you had school districts that were getting sites that they weren't buying necessarily. You know, I think it's particularly common in charter schools that you have somebody that donates the land, or they find some other way to acquire the land. So now that it's either purchasing or acquiring the land, they have to meet first with the local government. They have to provide them site plans. They have to provide them some specific information. There has to be discussion about it. The local government is to get their comments back with regard to all of that. And the local government can require them to provide a number of other things, including things like traffic studies and so on. So there's quite a bit of coordination now that's required in this bill before a school district can proceed and acquire and do something with a school site. This particular bill kind of became a catch-all. I talked before about, yeah, question?
All right, a question on that.
Yeah.
What about properties that they already own that aren't developed yet? Does it call for information on those sites?
Doesn't say anything about that. This is only when they acquire new sites.
So if they acquired a new site and said, well, we don't know what we're going to do with that,
Yeah, well,
then what do you?
what the bill says is that before they acquire the site, they have to meet with you and tell you what they're proposing to do with the property. So, if they don't know, I guess you could say, well, you can't acquire the site. Potentially, I don't know. It's something to look at. In this particular bill, the land use task force I talked about, which is a group that meets through the League of Cities and Towns and works out a lot of different land use issues between local governments and developers. And this bill kind of became a catch-all for a number of things. The biggest thing in this was with regard to the requirements for the installation of improvements like curb gutter, sidewalk, other kinds of improvements. And the bonding or the warranties that can be made for those, that's become a big issue in the last couple of years. Apparently with some local governments requiring some pretty, I will even say in some cases, outlandish things of private developers before they can go ahead and begin to start like building homes. They have to guarantee the improvements, they have to provide warranties, and they in some cases have to reconstruct or, I mean, it's gotten kind of onerous. This bill sets some limits on what local governments can do with regard to that. In some cases, you know, you have things where they're doing improvements that are required, like curb gutter and sidewalk, and then other things that are part of the site plan, like landscaping and some other things, but that aren't necessarily required. And some entities are saying you have to bond for all of that before we'll let you start pulling building permits. And what this bill says is you can only require the warranty and the bonding for those improvements that are required by your ordinances, not for other things that they may be doing that are not required by ordinance. That was part of their approval process. This bill also allows for utility companies to receive an exemption from local zoning requirements if the local government so decides. It's at the discretion, but it's for things like utility boxes and other kinds of facilities that utility companies oftentimes have to put in and have run afoul of zoning restrictions. This bill makes it so that the local government can exempt that if they want to from those kinds of restrictions. It limits the required signatures. It limits the signatures that you can require on a plat to someone who has some kind of a legal right associated with that plat. This came about because of things like, for example, you have somebody that's developing a subdivision. Right next to the subdivision is like a canal. You know, you don't know what the effect is going to be on the canal. The local government doesn't maybe particularly really feel like it's their obligation and responsibility, but they say to the developer, you got to go get the signature of the canal company before we'll approve that plat. Well, the canal company doesn't have any legal interest in that plat, but now they can hold up the approval of that subdivision process because the city or county is saying, go get their signature, and they're saying, well, we'll give you our signature if you do some improvements to our canal. That's, just one example. And so what this bill is saying is that you can't require signatures from anybody other than those who have a legal interest in the particular plat and the property that's going on. Amending a plat with common areas, the standard now is that you have to get up to 75% of the property owners to approve that. Again, you can't deny or delay a building permit for uncompleted, non-required improvements. Oftentimes these kinds of things like landscaping. And then a couple of years ago, there was a bill that was passed that had to do with a completely different issue, but what it said was that in counties, you can no longer require landscaping around a home of an area that was disturbed in the construction of a single-family home. And in some cases you had some of those requirements that were in place. This was a prohibition on all of that. This bill now exempts first-class counties from that particular provision. Didn't go far enough to do all of the counties, but did get that one out of there because it seemed to be, it was a particular issue that happened back then. Let me just quickly tell you about some of the failed bills because they failed this year, but I think we're likely to see them back. For the second year in a row, Representative Anderegg has had a bill in there that would severely restrict local government's ability to regulate home occupations. I think he's just philosophically opposed to saying that there should be any kind of regulation on home occupations. He did a bill last year that had to do with fees that are charged for home occupations. It failed. This year he had one, this particular bill, that said that, that it would have prohibited local governments from being able to charge business license fees for most home occupations. There was a certain category that they exempted out of that or still allowed there to be fees required, but generally you wouldn't be able to charge a business license fee for any home occupation. And that bill did not go anywhere. Again, I think because most saw that that was something that most didn't see as reasonable, but I wouldn't doubt that we'll see bills like this again in the future from Representative Anderegg. There was a bill that had to do with the regulation of beekeeping. And there were a lot of changes with regard to the beekeeping provisions, and a lot of it probably justified because it's, beekeeping has changed a lot and it's become much more acceptable in many places. And there were ways the state was regulating that. This bill made a lot of changes, but there was a provision right at the end of the bill that said local governments can do no regulation of beekeeping. Well, we have a number of jurisdictions around the state already that have some provisions in their zoning code as to regard where beekeeping can occur. And so this would have now said you can't regulate that anymore, so that became a problem. The bill, I don't think there was a lot of support for the bill in general, just because it wasn't a big issue. The bill sat and really didn't go anywhere in the end, but my guess is because of the other provisions about beekeeping, it'll come back, and we'll have to see whether that provision for local governments to be able to regulate, have any kind of say regulated beekeeping, or whether that's still in there or not, or gets taken out. There was a little bit of a kerfluffle that occurred with regard to scenic byways and the ability to have billboards along scenic byways. Several years ago, there was some pretty careful negotiation that went on between advocates of scenic byways and local communities and billboard companies to allow for the exemption of certain segments of scenic highways out of that designation, so they then could be allowed to have billboards along there. And we all know that there are some scenic byways that parts of them, they're not that scenic. And there are in areas where you have communities and some work going on. So there is a process in the legislation that would allow for that. This year, the proposal came in this bill that would have just taken local government out of this process altogether. So they wouldn't have had a say whether a segment of scenic byway in their county or in their city, if it were in the city, whether they have any say in that whatsoever. We all thought that was dealing with the billboard company, and indeed, Mr. Reagan and his folks were up at the legislature testifying in favor of this bill, and we all thought that. But we learned later that there was also some effort from UDOT behind this particular bill because of something that was happening in a particular community, that because of the efforts of that community, that in order to make some changes and to acquire some property, they needed to be able to make some changes in the location of billboards. And the community was basically dragging its feet, and nothing was happening. And it was dragging this whole project out for a long time. I won't throw the community under the bus. I know who it is, but I'm not going to say. And so UDOT was kind of behind this provision as well. But we eventually got the bill through some wrangling, got it changed around to putting the local government back into the process, but with some restrictions on the process. And everybody was reasonably happy with it. But the bill was not a top priority bill, and as I mentioned, there were some big issues right at the end of the legislative session. And the bill made it out onto the board to be voted on. It passed through the House very easily, but it was stuck in the Senate. And there were so many things going on that last night of the session. It finally made it out onto the board in the Senate at about 11 o'clock that night, but way down the list. And when the clock struck midnight, it was still about 2 or 3 down on the list and didn't make it and didn't get a vote. So it didn't pass this year, but my guess is it'll be back for a subsequent year, probably next year. This is the last bill I want to talk about. And again, it has to do with the local issue versus the state legislature being involved in it. A few years ago, there was a big to-do that erupted in Salt Lake City again over the potential designation of some areas of the Yellowcrest neighborhood that any of you may be familiar with in Salt Lake City, whether to designate some of that as a historic district. There were many people that lived in the neighborhood who really wanted to keep the character of the neighborhood and preserve and save those homes as pretty much as they were. And there were those who also owned homes in there that did not want the restrictions and regulations that went with having a historic district. It got into a big, ugly, and I will tell you from having been there, it was a nasty, ugly fight amongst those neighbors. It made its way all the way to the legislature. And Senate President, at the time he wasn't Senate President, but Senator Niederhauser, who is a realtor and probably knew a number of those people. And so there was a threat that the state would put restrictions on historic districts if the city didn't work things out. And so the state legislature put a moratorium on the future designation of historic districts in Salt Lake City as a result of that. We worked things out, we got a process in place. The legislature lifted the restriction. Things were moving along, but again, and I'll tell you, and it doesn't surprise me, those neighbors just cannot get along. And it erupted again into an issue. Again, they went to Senator, now President Niederhauser. He immediately said, and I'm surmising all of this because he never came out directly in doing this. Being president, he had many other things to deal with now, and had another senator carrying this bill. But it was obvious that this restriction that now would have required that before you could even begin to look at whether to create a historic district, you have to have the buy-in of 75% of the property. That's not to create the district, that's to even begin looking at creating the district and doing the work and the studies. Pretty onerous. And that bill was proposed, and my gosh, that bill was greased like glue. That thing was just sailing right through. It went through the House very easily, or the Senate, I mean, very easily. It's Senator Niederhauser's body. Went through there very easily, got over to the House. A little bit of wrangling and negotiating going on, but nothing. But the bill was sitting there all of a sudden, I think the next to the last day of the session. Just before lunch, this bill pops out. It's on the calendar to be voted upon. The House sponsor gets up, talked about property rights and the need to do this and everything else. And then there was an amendment that was put into the bill that would have made the bill only apply to Salt Lake County. And then he talked about that. Well, the amazing thing that happened was the amendment was voted down, another amendment was voted down, and then the bill went to a vote and it was voted down. I was flabbergasted. So was everybody else. I have never seen that. This was a greased bill. This was a bill that the Senate President wanted. It was a bill that had every indication of just, being kind of just going to sail through and there wasn't going to be a lot of heartburn about it. And yet it failed. And it was really interesting to me because I was up at the Capitol at the time, and then shortly after that, I see all of the guys from the real estate interests. They weren't particularly supporting the bill, but they're not going to oppose Senator Niederhauser, and they were helping him with it somewhat. And they were all over in the corner, just like, what happened? What happened? So later that day, I caught one of them, he was a friend of mine, and I said, what happened to that bill? He said, I think it was just a perfect storm. He said, this particular amendment, to make it apply only to Salt Lake County, those who were in favor of the bill didn't like the amendment because they were like, if this is a good deal for property rights, it ought to apply everywhere, not just to Salt Lake County. And those who were opposed to the bill didn't like the amendment because they thought it would make it more likely to pass because it now applied to just a smaller area. Well, those two groups together voting against the amendment wound up killing the amendment. Once that happened, it was like, dog pile on. Ah, we killed that one. Let's kill that next amendment. And then it was like, let's just kill the bill. And it failed. And we all have, and that's really what even the realtor lobbyists think is what happened. So I've never seen anything like that in the legislature. It was just really interesting. Of course, Salt Lake City and others that were in favor, again, of allowing a local jurisdiction to decide its own issues in its own way were really supportive and really happy about that. But I'm sure this will be back. I'm sure it'll be back. And I don't think it's going to happen the same way as it did this time. But from a guy who's been up at the legislature watching this stuff for 20 years, it was amazing. It was really fun to watch. I was like, wow, justice sometimes does happen. So it was kind of fun. Here's just a list of some other bills that failed, and we won't talk about those, but if you have any questions about them, feel free to give me a call and contact me about it. And that's it for the legislative update. Brent, I'm sorry I didn't leave you a lot of time for legal update.
Oh, I knew that would happen.
That, yeah, it looks like so again. Hang on just a second.
It was a fast reader, but that was...
Yeah, sorry about that. I should have left it up there.
I knew that you would need a lot of time for that, and so I prepared the handout. Best kind of speech in the world, a short one. There's my handout. Thank you very much.
This is